Welcome everyone to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. It's such a privilege to have those of you who just keep tuning in and watching these videos joining us again. It's a real privilege and an honour to have you watching. And we've got a really special guest with us today, Dr. Gavin Ashenden. And I'll just start by asking Gavin to say hello to us. Gavin, would you say hello?
Yes, hello, welcome. Thank you for spending the time and being part of our conversation.
Well, it's such a privilege to talk to you, Gavin. And you've said I can call you Gavin, which is wonderful, because I could call you various different things. I could call you the Reverend Dr. Gavin, because you've had such an interesting background. And I'll just give our viewers, our listeners, a brief introduction to your background before we proceed a little bit further. What's most interesting to me, of course, is that you've been chaplain to the Queen. Now, at that point, let me just say, of course, our supporters at Coalition for Marriage come from all faiths and none. And we call ourselves the largest pro-marriage group in the UK. And in terms of our supporters, registered supporters, we absolutely are. And I suppose the thing that distinguishes us from other marriage organisations is that we support this view that marriage is only between one man and one woman. And that's not how we've defined it, but that's how the marriage definition has observed marriage over millennia as something which can only be between one man and one woman. That's not to say that other things don't exist in a liberal democracy, and we'll come on maybe to talk about those in a while with Gavin, because I know you've got your views that you've expressed on those things. And the other thing I suppose that distinguishes us from other marriage organisations that you might hear in the media is that, we would not support things like no-fault divorce. We think that undermines the very nature of what marriage is, and putting something like that in place just for the exigencies of the court, for example, really makes a mockery of what marriage is and the marriage vows. But there we are. Now, Gavin, you've been a chaplain to the Queen. You've also been a cleric and an academic. You're a media pundit, personality, dare I say. You're a writer, you're a journalist, an extensive career. Not only that, but when you look at the cleric aspect of your career, you've been a cleric in the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, the Catholic Church, and there's so many things I could talk to you about. And you've also got a keen interest in the psychology of religion, which again is something perhaps we can talk about maybe at the end of the interview. We can pick up. I wouldn't mind picking your brains on, for example, Jordan Peterson's lectures on the psychology of Genesis. Very, very interesting. And you've also fascinatingly smuggled Bibles into Russia and been interviewed by the KGB for having done so. So you're a fascinating chap. But for those people who want to hear a discussion on the subject of marriage, because that's what we're about, of course, we'll talk about those things, because I know that you've got a keen opinion on marriage in terms of the cultural position we find ourselves in as a nation. And maybe we'll start there, because Carl Trueman, who I'm sure you've come across and we've interviewed ourselves, says that marriage is at the heart of our cultural trouble at the moment. And you yourself have spoken about things like aggressive secularism. And I wonder, let's start off with, from your point of view, what is marriage?
Marriage is a way of organizing society so that men and women can procreate and have children, and do so within the most stable and generative, the richest, the safest context. As human beings, we are rather dysfunctional. It's very difficult, whatever your philosophy or your faith, to marry, to use a pun, our aspirations and our performance. Yeah. And so in human relationships, there's always a gap, again, between what we want and what we can bring about. And inevitably, one needs to organize society in a way that allows people to have children in a culture that is best for the children and most productive for the rest of society. One of the things that we've done in the last 150 years is seen marriage and romantic love as essentially almost a consumerist thing, the thing that I want. But in previous generations, there's been a different perspective. This is what society needs. And partly this is because in earlier societies, as Peterson himself has often said, just surviving was a triumph. And you needed to find a way of finding a partner, because surviving in coalition with somebody else was more efficient than doing it by yourself. And if you had children in this coalition marriage, that was a more efficient way again of surviving than by yourself. So then the question was, what were the rules for having children with somebody else? And one of the most important rules was it had to be exclusive, because if the mother and the father were both going to look after the children, they both had to take proper ownership of it, of them. And again, in terms of mammals, children take the longest to rear for a long time. So it had to be exclusive, and it had to be pretty permanent. Otherwise, it didn't work. And so it's no surprise that from both a pragmatic sociological point of view, if you like, and a biological point of view, and from an ideological point of view, from the point of faith, both pragmatism and faith suggest you want an exclusive relationship that lasts, and then both society and the individuals involved can have the best chance of flourishing. Does that mean it's going to be easy, that there won't be difficulties, breakdowns, paradoxes, contradictions? Not at all. But we have to find the best way, the least problematic way forward. And faith and pragmatics both agree that a permanent relationship for the purpose of having children that's exclusive is the best way forward.
So why shouldn't that include same-sex so-called marriage? I mean, allowing people who love each other to get married doesn't necessarily mean that those things you just spoke about can't happen, does it?
So first of all, we have to agree on what standpoint we're talking from. If we were talking in a domestic and purely Christian context, then we'd say, what is it that God wants us to do? But that's a private conversation between believers. And anyway, the private conversation ought to be congruent with a public conversation. What God wants ought to make sense in a wider sphere. So let's take the wider sphere first of all. I think one of the reasons why I found the change of marriage to include homosexual relationships most problematic was because it was going to do two things. It was going to involve turning children into consumerist items, because one of the things the gay community wanted to do was to have children in order to say, look, we're just like you, or we're as close to you, the heterosexuals, as we can be. And we too want to express, want to live in a kind of family context. But the problem was that this always, because two men can't have a child together and two women can't either, this would always mean using surrogates in order to procure children. And the procurement of children in a situation where you end up by offending what must be one of the most basic human rights, which is to have access to your biological mother and father. The repudiation of that right for unborn children is an immorality. I mean, it's an immorality and it's an injustice. So from the very beginning, that seemed to me to be a serious flaw. There was another flaw, which was that it was quite ludicrous to watch legislators trying to work out what they would do with the notion of adultery. Again, if a marriage has to be exclusive, you have to define what adultery is. And I hope you're not watching this before breakfast, but essentially it must involve penetration. So it's very difficult to describe what infidelity for two lesbians might look like. And then I mean, again, lesbianism and male homosexuality are two almost entirely different things. We talk about gaiety, but they're not actually symmetrically congruent things. They're two very different experiences.
Which is why the conversation turned to the concept of, well, love is love. It's about love.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also why they're falling out over the trans movement so very badly.
Yeah.
They were only ever allies for the sake of political convenience, but never for the sake of ideological conviction, unless it was to repudiate heteronormativity. But the other issue then is infidelity and whether or not marriages should be exclusive. And the legislators, rather than face the challenges, which were almost impossible, that homosexual marriage produced, just dropped it. But the problem is always going to be then that you cannot have a doctrine of marriage that includes homosexual marriage and heterosexual marriage without one affecting the other. The homosexual community said, we want the kudos that you bring. But what that also means is the heterosexual community then have to accept the limitations and the distorted doctrine that homosexual marriage brings, which means no adultery and no exclusivity effectively, or no way of testing exclusivity. these are two very good reasons for a Christian or even a pragmatist to be very hesitant about changing something that has been millennia old and essentially worked very well. But behind it all has been the notion that romantic love and erotic love are the things that define us most or are most important to our humanity. And again, Christians, well, not just Christians, but I mean, Stoics and Buddhists and Epicureans and Muslims and Hindus would all reject that as being hopelessly narrow and solipsistic in a hedonistic way. You know, we are not defined by the way our genitals twitch, or even by which our romantic longings carry us, because romantic longings are dangerous things, and they usually don't last very long either. So there are philosophical reasons for being immensely hesitant about the way in which the eroticized and romanticized hedonism of the 20th century has made us change the very foundation of the way we organize society.
And interestingly, that aspect of an inability to define consummation and adultery has been equalized by no-fault divorce, which of course has abolished any excuse for divorcing. So it's effectively said, well, we don't need adultery because you can, split up for any reason, really, or no reason whatsoever.
Yes, and the problem with that is that marriage is not a private affair, and certainly in the way in which it's been understood in the liturgies of the churches we had. You don't marry in private, you marry before your community, and your community is asked whether they support you. And what happens to your marriage affects the community very seriously. It affects it not only in terms of morale and broken friendships and the way in which allegiances get formed together to support a new relationship, but it affects it in terms of the way in which single parents make the most enormous demands on the budget and the economy of a whole society. The cost of single parenting, which is a form of failed marriage, having children with only one, having children takes two persons. And then bringing the children up with only one of those persons is a form of covenantal failure. And the cost of that economically is just enormous. And therefore, taxpayers are just, I hate to be fiscally brutal, and this isn't normally the language I'd want to talk in. But if you pay taxes, you have an interest in how other people bring up their children if they make demands on the state.
And let's make the point. I mean, I was born of a single parent, or I grew up with a single parent mum, if you like. So I grew up in that environment, and she did find it hard. That's not to say that some single parents can't bring their children up very well and don't put everything they've got into it. We're not saying that at all, are we? We're just saying that as a matter of choice and as a matter of policy, promoting single parenthood would not be the route to go down.
So as a Christian, and this is how we began the conversation, I want to start off by saying we have the greatest of problems in building a bridge between our ideals and our capacity for carrying out our ideals. And I would be the first person to say that my capacity for carrying out my ideals is immeasurably flawed. And having got to my age, the number of times I've fallen flat on my face and have failed to carry out my ideals is immeasurable. But that doesn't mean I have to give up the ideals. What it does mean is that I mustn't impose them on other people without paying the price for them myself. And so there's always this very difficult balance of saying in a public conversation, look, let's agree on how we might most want to organize ourselves to live and to behave. And then let's also agree that we're going to fail. And now let's work out a relationship of holding those two things together. And in Christian terms, there's a very powerful way of doing it, which is that God calls us to impossible ideals. And then when we fail, he forgives us and helps us and recalibrates us. And inch by inch, we move performatively from very bad performance to slightly less worse performance, which is called grace, or works, both really. And that's how Christian theology manages to build that gap. It's a very effective way of managing the gap between aspiration and performance. I think it's better than other religions, which is why I'm a Christian and not a Muslim and not a Buddhist. If Buddhists did it better, frankly, I'd be a Buddhist. But I don't think they do. I don't think anything matches the extraordinarily transformative beauty of a relationship with Jesus and the way in which both psychologically and spiritually that helps us deal with failure, forgiveness, hope, and idealism. So that's why I'm a Christian. But as a Christian, I'm entitled to put my views and my experiences into the public square and allow other people to match them with what they prefer and what they've tested. And one of the things I've always been convinced of is that if Christianity is true and real, it has to deliver. And so we want to look at Christian ideals of marriage and say, well, have they delivered? And of course, from time to time, they've been twisted out of shape. They've been abused in different contexts. They've been improperly unaccountable. Of course, that's how things work. But in life, I don't see any other model of marriage that beats the Christian idea of interdependency, mutual, the level of vulnerable mutuality and responsibility that men and women share within this theory of Christian marriage.
And that's not just you, Gavin. It's not just you. It's every sociological researcher who's ever done, longitudinal studies and looked at large population bases and outcomes for children and for adults and for societies. They would all agree with you that actually long-term monogamous marriage between one man and one woman is the best thing for children by a long way, by empirical measures, a long way ahead of anything and everything else. And that isn't meant to be single parent phobic. Neither is that homophobic. It doesn't hate or fear anyone. It's just saying that actually this is the best thing for society and, should really be promoted if a government's going to promote anything in terms of human relationships. The idea of a government getting involved in love is love. Well, why should a government care who loves who? That's, it's got nothing to do with them. But producing the best version of the next generation, well, you're right. Maybe that is something the government might want to have a say on. A lot of people, though, would think it's got nothing to do with the government at all anyway.
So we have to clean our language up a little bit and I'll see if I can hold the line of thought in response to what you said. So first of all, when you say love is love, you don't mean love. You actually mean the F word. What you're really talking about is who has intercourse with who. And then the question is the government interested in who has intercourse with who? And the answer is, if you have any kind of socialist state at all, and the state takes any kind of responsibility for people, then who has intercourse with who matters greatly because it'll produce children, and the state takes an interest in the welfare and the protection of children. So absolutely the government's concerned and should be concerned. And it should then, in fact, should be a lot more concerned than it is at the moment, by and not wash its hands of producing. I mean, you can't have it both ways. You can't have a government that says, well, we're going to interest ourselves in the welfare of children as they're brought up to make sure they're protected and fed and educated and not molested, and then say, but we're not going to pay any attention whatsoever to the circumstances in which children happen. It would be like having an energy policy that dealt only with outcomes, but not with the accumulation of energy in the first place. You have to have both, but we don't have both because we have a philosophically and theologically incoherent society that has the utmost difficulty in working out the balance between private and personal freedom and corporate responsibility. We're nowhere near there at all. I mean, theocracies can do it and totalitarian regimes can do it, but democracy struggles very hard to do it. Well, that's okay. That may be part of the price we pay for democracy, but that doesn't let us off the hook to pay more attention to the balance of those things. The second thing I was going to say is that although you've talked about studies showing that the outcome for children is best when they have two parents that they're biologically related to, this is not a matter that's beyond being contested. I wrote an article about a year ago for a newspaper in the Channel Islands I wrote for, in which I put in the one sentence that that research made it perfectly clear that children were advantaged by being brought up by their biological mother and father. The editor was deluged with complaints that I was a bigoted homophobe and that he shouldn't publish it. And the editor then went to Wikipedia and said, Gavin, look, frankly, you're an undereducated, underinformed idiot. Look at all these studies on the internet that show that there is no difference at all in outcome with homosexual relationship. And I said to the editor, but they're plants. They're all fake. You can only get research funding for a project that's going to produce those results. They're not real. And I said, look, there's one that's real. Here it is. It's quite a famous and well-known one. in America, but all the rest are window shopping. And he said, well, I don't have time to work out which ones are not. And I said, well, but then you mustn't censor me, because I have taken the time and trouble. And one of the very useful outcomes, or rather one of the very useful side effects of this recent study that the Children's Commission has produced, is that finally, once again, we have a piece of research that is empirically acceptable, that says what we've been saying, but is denied by 99% of the university research work that's been done that you'll find on the internet. So you don't trust Wikipedia, and you really do have to work quite hard to decide whose results you trust and whose you don't. And of course, at the moment, if I was having this with you as an intellectual opponent, well, and you were a secularist, you would do what my editor did and his readers did. You'd say, well, you're just choosing the results that you want from the sources that you want. And initially, of course, it looked like that might be true, but it happens not to be true. It happens to be true, factually and empirically true. And as Peterson would say, why would it surprise you that children do better relating to their biological parents in a family unit where they're both present for as long as possible?
And I think when you look at, so again, you're absolutely right. You can cherry pick pieces of research and compare very poor parents in heterosexual relationships with very wealthy parents in homosexual relationships, let's say, and look at the charming outcomes in one compared to the other, etc. But when you look systematically across all the research, so if you look at the late Sarah McClanahan's work under Fragile Families, one of the largest sociological studies ever taking place, when you look at a book that people might want to look up, Same-Sex Parenting Research by Walter Shum, who looks across all of the research and looks at the standard of the research, and also looks because you're absolutely right, it's difficult to get funding or even to get published unless you're saying the right things these days across a whole range of subjects, not just this one. But he brings out things from the research which aren't always put up in the abstract at the beginning because they wouldn't get published, but are very definitely there with unequivocal results, as you'd expect, in terms of the outcomes for children more generally. So it is there if you want to look. You're absolutely right. But another problem, which I wonder if you might want to comment on, with the idea of society adopting this mantra of love is love, is, well, yes, that then allows for same-sex marriage, but then also actually allows for things like trans to creep in. It allows for the concept of pansexuality. It allows for things like minor attracted people, as they're calling themselves these days. We would know them as paedophiles, who are saying, well, I was born that way. Love is love, so you can't criticize me. And goodness knows whatever else might be down the line, and that's the problem when you take something as broad as love is love and apply that to society. Anybody's wants and desires are relevant.
Okay, so please stop me, because I'm about to launch into another long lecture.
Just go ahead.
So I'd like to talk first of all about the role of exceptions as a kind of postscript to what I said earlier on, and then address what you've just presented and not lose sight of it, because it's very important. Let me be personal for a moment and say that I think my own biological parents were probably two of the most incompetent parents you could ever have imagined. They shouldn't have been allowed to marry anybody, and they certainly shouldn't have been allowed to marry each other. And they should have been strongly supervised when they had 5 children. And they divorced, and I'm not at all impressed by the parenting skills that I was brought up with. And that doesn't mean I want to do a Meghan Markle and claim I'm a terrible victim. All I've said to my children is, look, my own background was pretty incompetent. I'm going to try and make slight improvements for you. And can I suggest you try and make slight improvements for any children that you have? But let's not blame anyone. Let's just try and manage a bit better and learn from our parents' mistakes. Now, the reason I say that is because I had 2 absolutely wonderful great aunts. They were sisters and they lived together. And let's imagine for a moment that my parents were killed in a car crash and my 2 aunts brought me up. They would have done a fabulous job. I would have, to be brought up by those 2 women, lesbian or not, they weren't. They were sisters. But it's not hugely important how they slept at night. If what we're trying to talk about is the the skills of nurture and stability that these two wonderful women might have brought. So, of course, I can easily imagine that a same-sex household could do a very good job in terms of nurture and care, of course. But the problem with that argument is it's got a philosophical flaw in it. And you must always be very hesitant and careful when anyone tries to extrapolate from a singular position to make a universal rule. So the fact that I might have had two very nice aunts, or there might be a same-sex couple sleeping together or not sleeping together, who could bring up, who are highly competent psychologically, and then doesn't mean that you abandon all other preferences. Or I'm sorry about my chiming clocks. It doesn't mean that that everything is equal on the table. It just means you have exceptions. Of course you do. But in particularly if you form legislation, you have to have normative rules, and you allow for exceptions. But you don't do what the protagonists of gay marriage have done and try and make a universal rule out of the exceptions. So that's so this is saying no, we're not phobic against two people of the same gender living in the same household, nor are we saying that their skills may be better or worse. We're simply saying you have to have a basic pattern, and it's inevitable. I mean, for example, think about stepfathers. I mean, the reason stepmothers have got such a bad press in the fairy tales is that we suffer. Jealousy is a huge problem. So if you factor in jealousy, it's one of the reasons why lesbian relationships are so desperately unstable. They are the most unstable relationship of all other pairings, and there are reasons for that. They bring a higher expectations to the quality of the relationship, and that they're terrified about somebody else running off with their partner. But jealousy matters enormously. It's another reason why polyamory doesn't work. It doesn't take jealousy seriously. And in the end, human beings have got a longing to have exclusive love they can count on in any circumstances, and that requires fidelity. So the problem with the problem with step parents is that although you're going to have some very good step parents, and there will always be exceptions, you can't love a child that isn't yours as much as you would love a child that is yours. It's just, that's part of the normative, biologically driven wiring that we live with. So it's essentially about recognizing the reality of biology. It's not taking a preference, an ideological preference, against one form of sociological grouping or another. Basically, we're trying to deal with facts all the time and not allow values to distort the facts. And that's the problem I have with the gay marriage propaganda, that there's a constant determination to pick a certain series of values and then to distort or to get rid of facts that don't support it, which is why it's not only difficult, it's impossible to get funding for anything that contradicts the dogma. So end of part one. But to come on now to what you were saying again, if I can keep my line of thought, we're faced with a very interesting phenomena in these years. I've always seen it a bit like a train, and the front of the train was feminism. And so the train trundles along the track, and the front carriage looks very attractive because feminism is all about justice and equity and fairness. And it says, once two things have happened, once the pill has happened, and once the miracle of white goods have happened, washing machines and so on, women are now free to enter the capitalist labor market or freer in the same way men are. But only because the pills happened and only because we have white goods. But having done that, how then do we adjust ourselves? And then the problem comes, well, men don't appear to be very good at looking after children generally, and on the whole, we're not. We're better at killing people who threaten us than we are changing nappies and teaching children with the patience that they require to grow up. But again, the question is that hardwiring or is it culture? So once again, the left and the right have had this huge argument about nature and nurture. And if you say it's nature, you're assumed to be from the right. And if you say it's nurture, you're assumed to be from the left. Well, I'm from the right. I believe nurture plays a much greater role than, nature plays a much greater role than nurture does. But the reason why this is important It's because what feminism did is it was predicated on the fact that it wasn't nature, that it was nurture, and you could recalibrate it. I'm absolutely fed up with women telling me how men should not look at women's chests. I mean, to give you a ridiculous and slightly far-fetched example, the Free the Nipple campaign in Brighton I saw the other day, we have lots of feminists saying, we want to walk around with bare breasts, and if men can't cope, they need to change themselves. And the feminist movement has not heard that men don't change. It's beyond us to change our basic instincts. Much as we'd even like to. I have always wondered why I seem to have an inbuilt fascination with women's mammary glands. It seems to me a ludicrous, intellectually, absolutely ludicrous thing, and yet it is the case. And if there was a way of accepting an invitation to change my cultural instincts, I would grab it with both hands. But most men will tell most women this appears to be a form of hardwiring, and we're very sorry. We will concentrate on your eyes as long as we can, but from time to time, our eyes will drop to your chest, and we apologize for it. But it's the way we're made. Now, the reason I'm being slightly flippant is to say that feminism won't accept that, and it's predicated on the fact that men behave through cultural pressure. And so the moment you get this unreality, and other unrealities will follow. And so after first wave feminism and second wave feminism, you have third wave feminism. And the problem with third wave feminism is that it brings in a philosophical change of enormous consequences. And that is that existential experience is everything. You can so it's just an extension of the culture of nurture versus nature argument. You can make the world whatever you think it ought to be in your head, and that's where both, to some extent, homosexual legitimization, because homosexuality acts on a scale, of course, and people do change. I mean, it seems to be the experience of most people. We've all had friends who found themselves engaged in a change of sexual appetite over their lives. Yep. And the homosexual protagonists know this. I mean, Tatchell began by saying that no one can change, and then later on he changed his mind to say it's a lifestyle choice. But the homosexual community wants to have it both ways. It wants to tell you they can't change and they're victims when it suits a political program, and it wants to tell you it's a lifestyle choice and they have control over it when it suits their ideological preferences. But they can't both be true. And in fact, the answer, and of course, it's a mixture of both. Of course, some people are hardwired, and there's a huge element of choice at the same time for some people, which is why you mustn't take a single experience and extrapolate a universal rule from it. But if we go on to what you were saying, we've engaged in a culture which places existential autonomy at the top of a hierarchy of values. And so whatever I think and I want to be, or whatever I want the world to be, this is where utopianism, false utopianism comes in. It must be true. And that's one of the reasons why we've moved into the whole nonsense of a trans debate. I say nonsense because statistically, people who suffered from this awful experience of having their mind and their body at odds with each other in terms of the way they experience their sex and or their gender was 0.01%, a very, very small group of disturbed people. But it's become almost a badge of victimhood, and it's expanded exponentially, way beyond the statistical norms that were found in most societies. And then, of course, as you quite rightly say, many of us knew this would happen, both for philosophical, sociological, and spiritual reasons. Next comes in paedophilia. Using all the material that the gay arguments brought us, which was, I'm born this way, and I'm a victim of my longings, and I can't help it, and so you must indulge me. And it was perfectly clear the moment the homosexual community used those criteria as justification for heterosexuals accepting the way in which they wanted to remodel their relationship with other people, that pedophiles would do the same thing. And so we've got a very real problem because, so first of all, they're changing the language, minor attracted people, and changing the language is the first sign that the people are trying to escape and change reality and hide behind language, which is exactly what's happened through postmodernism in the last 20 years. we've got a very, very serious problem, which is going to make it immensely difficult to protect children from the erotic desires of predators who will inflict them on them in a way that is utterly harmful. And you only need to go back to the information exchange people in the 1970s, where you heard these wretched paedophiles say, first of all, children consent, and secondly, they enjoy it, and thirdly, no harm comes from it, all of which were untrue.
Well, that's another interesting topic you raised, that concept of consent, which is in amidst the overwhelming increased amount of explicit sexualized teaching that takes place in our schools. The only caveat seems to be the one of consent, irrespective of the fact that children under 16 can't consent by law. But nevertheless, that seems to be the only thing which is taught. So in the absence of any kind of objective moral framework, the only thing that can be taught is consent. And that ties in exactly with what you're saying. And I suppose the potential decline, the potential threats to children, the potential changes in society's perception of children's exposure to sexualization, the whole thing becomes undermined.
Well, look, we're having two separate conversations again, and society won't join them up. So first of all, as you quite rightly say, the business of consent is being explored at the level of children, and only in order to persuade people that they can give consent, or that consent might be possible. But between men and women, the issue who make love or have intercourse, the issue of consent has become enormously fraught, to the extent that a man may say, I have objective evidence that consent was given. And the woman may then say, well, I might or might not have given it, but I withdraw it now. And in terms of the law, there's a very real danger he may be prosecuted for rape.
Yep.
Because he can't rely on the consent that was given at the time. And anyway, even if it was given, there are all the issues of drunkenness and irresponsibility and so on. So we have the greatest difficulty in establishing what constitutes consent between two grown-up adults who ought to be able to take their responsibility. But we can't do it. The law is struggling very profoundly, and police behavior, the practice of the courts, it's all shot through with the most dreadful inconsistencies because we cannot agree on what constitutes consent for adult. How on earth, to choose my language carefully, how on earth can we move from there to then say that we have any kind of confidence about the capacity of prepubescent children to consent to erotic experience imposed on them by an adult? I mean, one reaches for language that one shouldn't use in polite company.
Yep. And let's for the sake of our detractors, let's make very clear that any kind of sexual predatory offence and offenders should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Absolutely, we're not saying anything like that. But the whole conversation is a very difficult one when you involve and you extrapolate it down to children and the issue of consent. It's a slippery slope, which I would rather we don't go down as society. What if I can nudge you on a little bit in terms of children? Of course, we've got declining birth rates. We've got women giving birth much later. We've got record numbers of births outside of marriage, births to single parents. I suppose some might say, well, so what? Does it really matter?
I think if you think it doesn't matter, then read Tom Holland's book Dominion, because what Tom has done is to explore with considerable acuity the benefits that our present society has accrued through the Enlightenment, and trace them back to a particular view to a particular religion. I was very interested the other day when I heard him talking to John Anderson about fascism, because although I knew this in theory, again, sometimes it takes somebody else to join the dots for you. And it just had occurred to me the power of the argument that says that real fascism was the most total reversal of Christian value, because real fascism, as it was practiced by the Nazis, was the celebration of power over the incompetence and the immorality of weakness. So the weak were immoral by definition, and the powerful were moral by definition. And therefore, anything that the powerful did to the weak was moral, because they were superior and they had morality. Marxism, and totalitarian Marxism, is different because it's a Christian heresy. And so it uses the language of Christianity. And that's partly why we're having such trouble with wokeism, because it's hijacked all our concepts. And people are too lazy or too ignorant or too busy to try and untangle the spaghetti of the way in which the perversion of the way in which Marxism has perverted Christian concepts. One of the things that Holland makes very clear is the difference between real fascism and Marxism. And the reason I mention that is because the way in which we deal with predators and the abuse of power is enormously important. And the Christian ideals that have created a society which is hardwired to be compassionate, hardwired to protect the weak, hardwired to give a net for victims. These are Christian values. They didn't emerge out of nowhere, and they certainly weren't produced by the environment, by the Enlightenment. And if anything, Darwinian, hard Darwinism feeds straight into the Nazi ideology, survival of the fittest. And so Holland quite rightly suggests that our society can be likened to someone sitting on a branch and cutting the branch off from the tree, and they'll fall. The reason it matters that the Christian values are respected and kept is that without them, the law of we enter a world of the law of the jungle, real fascism, where might is right. I grew up reading a wonderful book called The Once and Future King, and it was about Arthurian morality and chivalry, but essentially it was a very bright schoolmaster called T.H. White, who was exploring the two philosophical games in town, which was Nazism on the one hand and Christianity on the other. And essentially it's between might is right or compassion is right. And the problem we have at the moment is our society is saying, well, we'd like compassion to be right, but we're going to destroy the tree that produced the branch on which we sit. And then, there's a marvelous moment in Holland's interview with John Anderson, where you don't often catch him looking blank, but he said, it's going to be a surprise when that branch falls, and who knows what will replace it? We genuinely don't know. Well, he may genuinely not know, but I know perfectly well. Because we know what Europe looked like
because we've seen it before. That's right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We've seen the worship of Thor. We've seen the worship of the Roman emperor. We've seen the worship of the Greek projective gods out of a disturbed psyche. We know very well what it looks like, and it's not pleasant.
So it's interesting because when you think, one of my questions to you will be, where to from here? But the where to from here is also always based on why are we here? And there's so much conjecture about why are we where we are. And you've mentioned things like birth control and women in the workplace and not needing the security of men. And you've got authors like Louise Perry and her arguments, case against the sexual revolutions, saying, well, actually, it's good for women to be married, and they might want to say to the man, you go and work and support me while I have children, and that might be a good thing. So there's that whole argument as to why we are where we are. There's the whole liberalism tends towards tyranny, because as you become more and more liberal as a society and open it up for smaller and smaller groups, you then have to control what people think, and the outcome of that isn't good, but it's a natural tendency maybe of liberalism. You've then got the argument, well, it's orchestrated. There are some movers and shakers who have an interest in the destruction of the family for whatever reason, maybe for control, because families don't need big governments. They're autonomous. They can live and work on their own and, teach themselves. And civil society, Roger Scruton's idea, civil society being built up from the bottom, not from the top. And then, of course, you've got the spiritual argument, spiritual wickedness in high places, rulers of the darkness of this world. Where are you in terms of diagnostics of why we are where we are in terms of that range?
Well, yeah, I think you've done a very good job indeed of describing the elements that have made us. Well, it was really very well done. And the only thing I'd do is I'd make more of the state versus the family argument, because it seems to me that right at the front of the queue of the forces you talked about are those who are promoting the state, and the family appears to be the greatest problem that they have in doing that, which may be politically and philosophically why there's been such a huge attack to it.
And it might be why the wealthy are still marrying, which is quite interesting. And marriage rates are much higher among the better off than the less well off, which is very interesting.
It is, and that again is a whole long conversation. But so you're asking me for a piece of sort of personal self-disclosure. One of the things that's happened to me as I've grown older is, I mean, I've worked in a number of disciplines. I've worked as a parish priest. I've worked as an academic. I've both taught and I've taught psychology. I did some postgraduate research with the Jesuits, which I took into the academy. I've been a broadcaster. I write a bit now, but there are a number of different arenas in which I've tried to be competent, tried to exercise competence. And again, once again, you know, like so many other things, if you're talking about morals and ethics, you have to have a hierarchy of values and tell people what they are, so that, because by tracing things back to your presuppositions, everything that's how one discovers how everything else flows. So philosophically, we ought, you know, there ought to be this moment of disclosure where we tell people, well, here are my constituent foundational arguments from which everything else flows. Mine is a metaphysical one. I've come back time and time again to the reality of a spiritual struggle. Essentially, this is a variation on philosophy. You have to have, you know, you have to have a worldview, and behind all the political pragmatism or the gender studies, the way in which we form sort of the existential categories we value, behind them all is a philosophical worldview. And the problem with a materialist philosophical worldview is it just doesn't deal with morals very well. Morals are more than empirical rules that lead to the best outcome. They are that, but they're more than that. And I think it was Auschwitz, discovering Auschwitz as a teenager, that first made me ready to accept metaphysics as a primary arena from which everything else would flow, simply because I couldn't believe that human beings had it in them to be that wicked to other human beings. I didn't grow up with such a low animalistic view of human beings. I couldn't contain in my head a world which contained Shakespeare and Beethoven and Mozart and Palestrina and the death camps run, I have to say, by the worst people who ran them were the Ukrainian Nazis. Just to strike a note into current affairs. And
there's a whole other conversation we could have. Yeah.
There's a whole other conversation. Well, I'm just flagging it. But meanwhile, so I had to turn to. I philosophically had to turn to notions of cosmic good and evil. And that's one of the reasons that prepared me to become a Christian, because I found that the Christian way of dealing with it worked best. And then as a Christian, tempted as I was to empiricism and rationalism and liberalism, I found myself dealing firsthand with forces that I would say would, without any doubt at all, were demonic. And this is this experience of the demonic and also, I suppose, of the angelic, and my understanding of the Holy Trinity, that means that my first category of analysis is metaphysical. You know, then in the face of people who say, well, that's a bit, you know, if Dawkins was here, he'd say, well, you know, how does that link with the rest of reality? And one of the arguments I would have with Dawkins is I say, well, it links extremely well. The chain of values that flow from this metaphysical analysis I have, that everything flows out of a fight between good and evil, upon which is predicated the gift of free will, because without free will, we cannot experience or negotiate good and evil. And if you have free will, then all the things we've talked about that so far follow, including this appalling gap between ideal and aspiration. So yes, as far as I'm concerned, this thing only makes proper sense if you deal with it as a conflict between good and evil, with humans caught in the middle, and rather dualistically, but I find it works to help me organize my thinking, this great struggle within each human being to choose the angelic over the animal. And by that, I don't mean I don't love dogs or think that the biological world is anything other than quite stupendously wonderful. But within human beings, we have the capacity for what I would call the angelic. And we have the capacity for the utterly reflexive, self-serving, red in tooth and claw, animalistic. And it's that choice between the two, I think, it's in that choice between the two that this metaphysical world I'm talking about is often most clearly expressed.
Interesting. Your experience of Auschwitz, it's not strictly relevant to our conversation around marriage and what forms of family and the best types of family, but it is quite interesting. My grandfather on my mother's side, I never knew my father, as I say. He was British, but my grandfather came over after the war. Where he lived was given back. He came from Poland, but he had been a prisoner of war. And similarly to your experience, he told me when I was very young, he died when I was quite young, but the man's inhumanity to man, if you can use that phrase, and the things as a young child that he told me that he witnessed, in a prisoner of war camp, were, you just think, wow, I mean, it forms you as a personality to hear those things at a young age. It really does have an effect. But what's the solution then? So are you saying that there is no solution available to man? You've just got to pray and leave it with God? As a Christian, you might say that, or is there something else?
Well, I mean, so the solution is to be saved by faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, who rescues us forever from condemnation and promises new life, and all the longings that we have become fruitfully fulfilled in this place beyond time and space we call heaven. That's the solution. Short of that, I think what you're asking is, how do we cope? Yeah. In the meantime,
I mean, advice to Liz Truss, if you like, the new Prime Minister, advice to take the nation forward out of our malaise into something which is hopefully not going to fall into Unwin's trap of having abandoned monogamy, spirituality, and male and female sexuality. Therefore, our society is doomed. Let's revive it somehow from a government policy perspective. While I may agree with you as a Christian in terms of the need for salvation, from a government policy point of view, that's a tough one. So in terms of what would you advise the new Prime Minister?
Well, I would suggest that the new Prime Minister engages in a piece of intellectual revisionism. The fact is that all the things that we value in terms of the poor being taken care of, education, health, compassion, hospices, they were all produced by the Christian community, essentially to begin with the monastic movement. And at some point, the state took them over. But there should always be a partnership between the state, which does things badly on the whole, and private enterprise. And one of the things that the Christian community has been very good at is private enterprise of compassion. And it was absolutely appalling when, for example, the Christian adoption homes were kicked out of business because they wouldn't for reasons of personal integrity, engage with same-sex couples, because they already knew what the Children's Commissioner has recently discovered, that the outcomes are better with complementary couples. But so I would say to the incoming Prime Minister, the people who will be the best partners for compassion in the state is the Christian community and the church. And sadly, the Church of England, at any rate, has given up being Christian and it's become almost entirely. And I know this sounds like
no, that's a whole other conversation. You're absolutely right.
A whole other conversation. And if I'd said it 5 years ago, you might have thought I was sour grapes or I was being dogmatic, whatever. Yes. But the last 6 months, the way in which the Church of England has simply swallowed wholesale and completely the values of cultural Marxism is astonishing, even to a cynic like me. Cynic in the sense I was cynical about the Church of England's capacity to be Christian. But putting that to one side for a moment, I would say, do not treat Christianity as being relativistically on par with everything else, because it's better than other religions, it's better than other philosophies, it's better than other political programs at accompanying you with compassion, and its ethics have produced better outcomes. So you would find there'll be fewer demands on the state's budget if you readopted some of the Christian virtues and ethics that made society what it is. But if you reject them, then you'll find a greater budget on the state, and you'll have less money to do with the things you want to do, because you're having to prop up the fallout of human incompetence, that are hedonism and self-interest, and
that's quite clear. Yeah, we know from the Relationship Foundation, a couple of years old, their figures now, the cost to the taxpayer of marriage breakdown, 51 billion a year. We often mention that fact, which is equivalent to our national defence budget. It's very expensive picking up the pieces when marriages fall apart. And just look at the crime levels. And if you look on a graph at the increase in reported crime over the last 50 years and chart that against the number of children born outside of marriage, and you think, well, goodness me, that's a stark correlation. And of course, people will just put it down to that correlation, not causation. But, that's an argument which they will say for everything. Well, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation.
Yeah, but we know it's both. I mean, one of the reasons why Jordan Peterson has been so enormously successful is because he's embodied psychologically the values of fatherhood, and partly because it mirrors who he is intellectually and also who he is therapeutically and who he is philosophically, and he's put those out in the public space. And who would have expected that a rather quaint Ontario professor of psychology would meet this abyss of yearning for fatherhood that the YouTube has been able to give him a platform to do. So we know that there's something very badly missing. And that's one of the reasons why we say it's not just correlation, it's also causation. We've got evidence for it. But and again, there's another huge conversation to be made about the fatherhood of God and the way in which God as father has been made inaccessible by feminist and relativist propaganda. And that God as mother, as C.S. Lewis said, produces an entirely different religion, something that takes you towards Gaia and safety first, as we're our whole health safety culture derives.
So essentially, you would say for the incoming Conservative Prime Minister, can we be more conservative, please? Which perhaps might make a bit of sense.
Yes, that's such a fine way of putting it. I won't try and add to it. Brilliant.
Gavin Ashenden, it's a privilege to talk to you. There's so many other things I would love to talk to you about, but I've taken enough of your time. I feel guilty for having taken up so much, but it is a real privilege. I'd love to talk to you about some other things at some point in the future, but for now, can I thank you for your time? Wish you all the best with everything you're doing, and it's great to talk to you today.
It's been lovely to have the conversation, and thank you for those of you who've stuck it all the way through.
Yeah, indeed.
I've got to the end. Very glad to have your company. Thank you.